we progress from week to week in this course, I want to be able to give students the opportunity and the ability to refresh themselves on some basic grammar pieces. One of these pieces that I think is extremely important for students to know is that of punctuation. Now, most students, they're going to know about between sentence punctuation, which is a period, a question mark, and an exclamation point. The example there, the student read their required chapters. Well, the punctuation at the end of this sentence is a period. And honestly, 95% of the time that you write, you're going to be using a period. Students know when to use a question mark. If you're asking a question, you use a question mark at the end of a sentence. However, I will give a word of warning in respect to an exclamation mark. Students, very rarely in academic writing, very rarely will you ever use an exclamation mark unless you are quoting somebody else with some exclamatory statement, wow, great, and you're quoting that person. It's considered, non-academic writing if you are almost shouting at your reader by putting an exclamation mark. So word to the wise, just really don't do that. You're really just going to be using a period. The punctuation that really stumps most students is a punctuation that is inside of a sentence. You have commas, semicolons, dashes, parentheses. At least for today, we're only going to focus on a comma and in a particular situation. For example, here there's an example, Mary lost her keys this morning, comma, but found them this afternoon. Most students know when to use between sentence punctuation, but using that within sentence punctuation, honestly, unfortunately, it is actually a 70-30 rule. 70% of the rules apply for grammar, and 30% of the time, sometimes I feel like it's a guessing game. But let's talk about some set rules so that I can give you some information that will be able to help you. Let's talk about dependent and independent clauses. Students already write with dependent and independent clauses in their sentences. I just don't think we recognize that we do. So let's talk about a dependent clause. I remember this particular clause because if someone were to be dependent on someone else, they would rely on someone. They can't stand on their own. They're not free. They have to have something or somebody else to help support them. Well, a dependent clause is no different. A dependent clause is a group of words and it cannot stand by itself. It needs an independent clause to make a sentence. For example, if I were to give you the sentence, since I have been in college. If I gave you that sentence, you would be asking me, well, what about since I've been in college? Yes, there's a noun in there. Yes, there's a verb in there. But the reader is left with a question in their head saying, this is not a full expression of a sentence. And that's correct because it's a dependent clause. It depends on more to make it a full sentence. The second type of clause is an independent clause. It's a group of words that it can stand by itself, and it does make a complete expression of thought. For example, I have learned so much. That can stand all by itself. There's not much more to be said. You could add another sentence afterwards and to be able to complete the expression or expand on the expression, but this I have learned so much sentence, it stands on its own. So here's a rule of thumb for within sentence punctuation when it comes to dependent and independent clauses. When a sentence begins with a dependent clause, it is always followed by an independent clause. And there is always a comma in between the two clauses. However, the reverse is not true. If a sentence begins with an independent clause, it does not need to be followed by a dependent clause. And if it is followed by a dependent clause, there is no comma between the two. Let's look at the examples that I have here. All right, since you went away, I feel sad. Well, it started out with a dependent clause. There has to be a comma there, and it's got to have an independent clause to finish it. So you can see, since I went away, comma, I feel sad. Then the next example is an independent clause. I feel sad since you went away. We went ahead and put a dependent clause on the end of this, but if I had just said I feel sad, I could have ended it and put a period there, and it would have been an independent clause. However, a dependent clause was added, but no punctuation needs to go between the two. So let's practice for a moment. I'm going to read these out loud, and I'll give you a couple of moments to be able to answer, and let's see if we get them right together. So identify the type of structure clause and if punctuation is needed. Number 1, because I am late, I will not bother running an errand. You should have said that because I am late is a dependent clause. There needs to be a comma after the word late, and I will not bother running an errand is an independent clause. So remember, a dependent clause, if it starts the sentence, you've got to have punctuation to separate the two clauses. It's got to be the comma, remember. 2, I will call you tomorrow if I don't talk with you tonight. All right, so this is actually an independent clause. It starts with an independent clause and it ends with a dependent clause. Now remember a moment ago, if it starts with an independent clause, you can actually end it and it'd be fine, but if you have a dependent clause after it, there is no punctuation that separates the two. It's just a continuation of one to the other. Last example. Before you begin studying, you will probably want to rest. So before you begin studying, that is a dependent clause. I've got to have a comma after the word studying, and then it separates the rest of the sentence, which is an independent clause. So remember, you start with a dependent clause, you've got to have a comma, and then go on to the remainder, which is an independent clause. I hope that you did wonderfully on those exercises, and within the Blackboard I actually gave additional web links so you can continue to practice the independent and dependent clauses and make sure that you are solidifying your understanding of the punctuation that is required for these.